"My name is Darryl," and I wasn't supposed to hear it. It wasn't some big dramatic moment. There were no slammed doors, no thrown dishes, no screaming matches. Just a strange draft coming from the hallway vent. That's how it started. That Saturday evening, I was alone downstairs, sitting on the floor next to a cardboard box labeled winter coats that I'd promised to reorganize since the weather turned. Chelsea was upstairs, supposedly working on her journal or reading, things she always said she needed space for lately. The house was quiet, eerily quiet, so when I heard her voice, faint and clipped, I didn't think much of it, until the tone of it made me stop mid-fold. The vent above me let out a soft hum. I leaned in a little, and that's when I heard her say, "I feel trapped, Jonah. It's like, every time I see him, I feel smaller. I can't stand the way he looks at me like he's still in love." I froze. At first, I thought it was about someone else. A story she was telling. Something fictional. But then she said my name. Darryl is nice. He's too nice. And boring. It's exhausting pretending everything's fine. I didn't breathe. I just sat there, hands resting on that stupid box of coats. Her voice dropped into a whisper, and the man on the other end, Jonah, apparently, chuckled. "Then why stay?" he asked. And her answer was a knife to my chest. "I don't know. Comfort? Guilt? The house. I don't love him. Not anymore. I don't even know if I ever really did." I didn't move. I didn't blink. I didn't even cry. I just felt nothing. Like all the color had drained from the room, and I'd been hollowed out in a single sentence. The air around me shifted, thicker, heavier somehow. My legs felt disconnected from the rest of me. She kept talking. I didn't hear much more. I didn't want to. But I remember one last sentence clear as day. "I'm waiting for the right moment to tell him. But it's easier just to let things fade." That night, I didn't sleep. I lay beside her in bed, feeling like a stranger in my own skin. She kissed me goodnight like nothing had happened. Like she hadn't said those things just an hour earlier to a man I'd never heard of before. But I had heard. Every word. And something inside me broke. Not in anger, not in rage. It just gave out. Like a frayed thread finally snapping. I didn't confront her. I didn't shout. I didn't even look at her differently. Instead, I got quiet. I watched. I listened. I started paying attention to all the things I had been too blind to see. And what I found was worse than I could have imagined. But I'll get to that. This was just the beginning. The next morning, I found myself staring at the dining room table. Not eating, not drinking, just staring. The chairs were off. 3 of them were pushed in neatly, like always. But the fourth, the one Chelsea used when she sat and painted her nails or flipped through fashion blogs, was angled outward, just slightly. As if someone had been sitting there late at night, facing the hallway. It didn't matter. It shouldn't have. But when your world tilts even slightly, you start noticing the things you used to ignore. Everything feels like a clue. A breadcrumb. A message you missed before. Chelsea came down about an hour later, barefoot, humming softly like nothing in her life was broken. She wore one of those oversized sweatshirts with the neckline slouched over one shoulder. The same one she used to steal from me years ago when we first moved in. I remember loving that sight once. That morning, it felt rehearsed. Like a stage play she'd forgotten I no longer bought tickets for. She made coffee. She didn't offer me any. She scrolled through her phone at the table while I sat across from her, pretending to read a magazine that still had last month's date on the cover. I watched her fingers swipe, then pause, then type, then swipe again. She had a secret. That much I was sure of now. I didn't know if it was Jonah or someone else, or some version of herself that she didn't think I could understand. But she was hiding something. Something that had been there long before I heard her say she hated being with me. The problem was, I didn't want to be dramatic. I wasn't the kind of man who flips tables or cries in doorways. I wasn't going to beg her to love me or ask her what I did wrong. Instead, I began doing something that felt unnatural at first. I started pretending not to notice. That day, I told her I'd be working late. I wasn't. I just sat in the library downtown for 5 hours, watching people come and go, wondering how many of them were walking around with hearts like mine, shattered quietly, invisibly. I came home after dark. She wasn't there. Her car wasn't in the driveway. The house smelled different, like cinnamon and something else I couldn't place. There was a wine glass in the sink, still wet inside. Lipstick smudged along the rim. 2 different sets of keys sat on the side table by the door. Hers. And someone else's. The only thing she left me was a sticky note on the fridge. Went out with Sophie. Don't wait up. XO. Sophie hadn't called our house in months. Hadn't visited since Christmas. And even then, she didn't stay long. I didn't text her. I didn't call. I just sat on the couch and stared at that angled chair again. The way it faced the hallway. The way it wasn't quite right. I knew in that moment that I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't paranoid. I wasn't broken or insecure. I was just finally awake. And Chelsea had no idea. What she didn't know was that I'd already made a plan. A quiet one. But when it unfolded, she wouldn't be humming anymore. That Tuesday, I changed the way I moved through my own home. I stopped walking with heavy footsteps. I stopped clearing my throat when I entered a room. I even turned off the sound of my phone's notifications, every click, every buzz. I didn't want to alert her anymore. I wanted to become background noise. Because something told me she'd already removed me from the frame. Like I was furniture. A picture on the wall. A coat hanging by the door. Chelsea worked from home on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She said it helped her balance her creativity. What I didn't know until that day was that it also gave her privacy. I left the house like normal around 8:30, pretending I had an early meeting. I even slammed the door for good measure and started my car, but I didn't go far. Just down the block, behind the community garden, where the city left old mulch piles and unused benches. I sat there for over 2 hours, staring at my steering wheel, heart pounding like I was waiting to rob a bank. And at 10:47 a.m., I quietly let myself back into the house using my key. I didn't expect much. Maybe a call. Maybe a weird Zoom conversation with someone named Jonah. But what I heard when I stepped into the hallway made my skin go cold. It wasn't talking. It was a zipper. Not slow. Not casual. Fast. Urgent. Followed by feet shuffling. And then something that sounded like laughter. A man's. I didn't move toward the noise. I didn't barge in. Instead, I walked backward, very slowly, out the front door, heart thudding like it might actually break my ribs. I sat on the steps for exactly 13 minutes. I counted. Then I left again. This time for real. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just existed in silence the whole drive to an empty parking lot outside a shuttered outlet mall 20 minutes away. I sat in the back seat of my own car with the windows down, listening to the wind and wondering who she was now. Because whoever zipped that dress, or those pants, wasn't married to the version of Chelsea I thought I knew. When I returned that evening, the house was spotless. Like nothing had happened. Chelsea was in the kitchen stirring something that smelled like basil and lemon, and she smiled at me like the world hadn't shifted under our feet. "You're quiet today," she said, pouring me a glass of water with a lemon wedge like it was some act of affection. I nodded. Just tired. And then she kissed me. Softly. Briefly. On the cheek. Like I was her cousin. That night, while she slept next to me with her hair wrapped up in a silk scarf, I stared at the ceiling and realized something strange. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I wasn't even heartbroken. What I felt was something entirely different. Freedom. It crept in quietly, like a guest you didn't invite, but were glad showed up anyway. Chelsea had been right about one thing. It was exhausting pretending everything was fine. The strange thing is, when someone betrays you, it's not always the big moments that tear you apart. Sometimes, it's something as small as a sock. It was a Friday afternoon. The sky outside was gray, low-hanging, almost metallic. I had taken the day off. I told Chelsea I was going to visit my cousin in Albany, a cousin who, truthfully, I haven't seen in 5 years. She smiled, told me to have fun, then asked if I'd remember to grab some almond milk on my way back. As if I was just running errands. She had no clue I wasn't going anywhere. Instead, I parked a block away and walked through the alley, letting myself into the backyard gate like I was invisible. Our neighbors were gone for the weekend, camping trip with their kids, so there was no one to see me duck behind the hedges and wait. It was cold. My hands started to sting from holding my phone for too long, fingers locked on the screen, camera ready. I wasn't proud of it, but I needed to know. I waited for hours. Nothing. At around 2:17 p.m., I almost gave up. But that's when the side door opened. A man walked out first. Tall, broad shoulders, wearing a dark flannel and jeans that looked a little too new for a handyman. He didn't look around. Didn't move like he was visiting a friend. He moved like a man who just had dessert in someone else's kitchen. And then Chelsea appeared in the doorway. Hair pulled up. Barefoot. She handed him something. A small white cloth. He smiled, leaned in, and said something I couldn't hear. Then he walked down the driveway, got into a silver sedan, and disappeared. I stood there a little longer, even after the door closed behind her. Later that night, I waited until she was asleep and went to the laundry basket in the guest bathroom, where she kept her delicates, she once said, because I didn't know how to separate anything properly. There, crumpled between a pair of leggings and a camisole, was a man's sock. Not mine. Not any pair I'd ever seen. I held it up and stared at it like it might speak. Then I caught the scent. Cologne. Not overpowering, but sharp. Like something you'd wear to a rooftop bar, not to help your wife with groceries. And that's when I realized she hadn't even bothered to hide it. It was all so casual, so mechanical. And in that moment, I felt something I didn't expect. Pity. Not for her. For me. For the version of myself that believed I was part of something real. For the man who once thought Chelsea's silence was just tiredness, not distance. For the guy who used to think a rough patch was something two people actually worked through. I didn't confront her that night, but I did something else. I started making space. Emotionally, mentally, physically. I moved my documents into a locked drawer. I took my passport out of the shared safe. I changed the password on my phone. I even began scanning all our financial records and emailing them to a private cloud account. Chelsea noticed none of it. She was too busy texting someone with her screen tilted just out of view. And all the while, I kept smiling, kept hugging her, kept pretending. Because now I wasn't waiting for the truth. I was waiting for the perfect moment to disappear. Chelsea made spaghetti that night. With garlic bread. She even lit candles like it was some anniversary we both forgot about. She wore that deep green dress, the one she said made her feel expensive. I noticed the lipstick was different too. Bolder. Something about the red was colder than usual, almost calculated. I sat across from her, chewing slowly, watching the steam rise from my plate. She talked about her day like it was just another Tuesday, pretending not to notice that I barely responded. Her laugh was louder than necessary. She kept reaching for my hand across the table like we were still newlyweds. But what caught me most was the second plate. She had set the table for 3. When I asked why, she froze for a moment, then laughed it off. Oh, I was on the phone when I was setting the table. Just a mistake. But I knew better. There was too much sauce, too much garlic bread, too many forks. She had planned for someone else to come over. Someone who never showed. And I realized, she wasn't just cheating. She was trying to see how far she could go before I snapped. I didn't give her the satisfaction. I told her the food was great. And in my head, I started listing what I'd take with me when I left. Not much, just enough to prove I had existed. The house was so quiet that morning, I thought something had broken. No birdsong, no traffic through the windows, no coffee brewing. Just silence. Like the whole world had stepped out and left me behind. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, watching Chelsea sleep. Her back turned to me, one leg curled under the blanket, the other dangling off the bed like she couldn't decide whether she wanted to stay or go. Even in her sleep, she seemed undecided. She had no idea I was leaving that day. There was no suitcase by the door. No fight. No letter. No drama. Just a man who'd quietly accepted that he no longer belonged in his own home. I didn't take much. A few clothes. My old journal. The framed photo of my parents that sat on my side of the dresser. It wasn't rebellion. It was memory preservation. Before I stepped out, I walked through the living room one last time. Everything looked normal. Too normal. Like a stranger's Airbnb that had been lived in just enough to fool you. I left my keys on the counter. And that's when I heard it. The front door opening. Chelsea. She wasn't supposed to be awake. But there she was, hair tied up, eyes wide. Wearing the same robe she used to wear on Sundays when we'd make pancakes and argue about what movie to watch. She looked at the bag in my hand, then at my face. And for the first time in a long time, she looked afraid. "Where are you going?" she asked, voice flat. I stared at her for a second. Not angry, not bitter, just finished. "I'm going somewhere I can breathe," I said. She blinked, like that sentence didn't register. Like it was in another language. Darryl, wait. But I didn't. She had already waited too long to say anything that mattered. And I had already heard everything I needed to hear through the vents. I drove for hours that day without direction. I passed familiar roads, unfamiliar towns, gas stations where the pumps were taped off, diners where old men sat alone at corner booths. Everything looked both distant and strangely familiar, like the whole country had been built from pieces of my broken home. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. But my hands stayed tight on the wheel the entire time, knuckles pale from holding on too hard to a life I'd already left behind. The sky turned gray halfway through the drive. Rain rolled in fast. Heavy drops slapped the windshield like warnings. I pulled off at a rest stop with a leaky roof and no coffee machine. It was there, alone in the parking lot, that I opened the trunk. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I just needed to see what I had taken with me, to ground myself. And there it was. An umbrella. Not just any umbrella. A large, navy blue one with a cracked handle and a faint scratch across the top. Chelsea had once borrowed it during a sudden storm and never returned it to its hook by the front door. But what made my stomach turn wasn't the umbrella itself. It was the scarf tied around it. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't hers. It was patterned with small golden anchors, a style I'd never seen in our house before. Tied neatly, deliberately, like someone had used it and left it behind. I stood there in the rain, holding that absurd umbrella and wondering how long she had been leaving pieces of someone else in places I once called mine. It was such a small thing, but it felt louder than anything she'd ever said. I closed the trunk gently, not because I was trying to stay calm, but because I'd realized something deeper. Chelsea had left long before I did. She just never packed a bag. 3 weeks later, I stood at a kitchen window in a small town I'd never meant to find. The apartment was barely furnished, a wooden table, a mattress on the floor, a second-hand lamp that flickered if you breathed too hard. But the window looked out at a lake, and every morning, light poured through it like forgiveness. I never thought peace could feel like this. I used to think healing had to be loud, shouting, burning, closing doors with finality. But this was different. This was quiet. This was stillness. Chelsea had tried to contact me after I left. 5 missed calls. 2 emails. 1 voice message that started with, "You can't just walk out," and ended with, "You misunderstood everything." I didn't reply. Not because I was bitter, but because I didn't need to anymore. I had understood perfectly. She hated being with me, and I had finally listened. I took a job doing part-time bookkeeping at a local gallery. The owner, a woman named Lorraine with silver hair and hands always covered in paint, didn't ask questions. She just handed me a key and told me, "The coffee's better if you stir it twice." On my 3rd week, a little girl came in with her dad. She pointed at a painting of an empty dock and asked, "Why does it look so lonely?" Her dad smiled and said, "Sometimes lonely things are just waiting for the right person to notice them." I didn't expect the lump in my throat. I didn't expect the calm that came after. That night, I made tea. I sat at the wooden table. I turned on the flickering lamp. And I wrote a letter, not to Chelsea, but to the man I had been. I told him it wasn't his fault. I told him he gave everything, even when it wasn't appreciated. And I told him it's okay to let go. Not because he was weak, but because he was finally strong enough to stop holding on to someone who had already let go. Then I folded the letter and slipped it between the pages of a book I hadn't finished reading. Not as closure, but as a promise. Because somewhere out there, life was still happening. And I was finally in it, not just surviving it. And that was the most shocking part of all. Not that she didn't love me, but that I'd finally learned to love myself.